For joining us. So we're just giving it a moment for folks to load into the Zoom room, and we'll just get started in a second. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are coming from, and welcome to the WIDA International U.S.-India Intensive Trade Seminar. Each year, we choose a country or a region or topic to highlight, and we're pleased to focus this year on the world's most populous country and its largest democracy, India. We're so pleased you could join us. We'd like to give a special thanks today to our WIDA International sponsors whose support enabled us to make this seminar free to attend for guests joining us anywhere in the world. The National Pork Producers Council, Trade Data Monitor, Visa, Personal Care Products Council, Coupang, the Information Technology Industry Council, Mondelez International, U.S. Council for International Business, and the National Foreign Trade Council. We'd also like to thank our WIDA Academy sponsors who support all of WIDA's educational activities, the American Apparel and Footwear Association, the Christina Bachjeiter Charitable Trust, Microsoft, and Coupang. The seminar we are having this week is broken up into 3 parts. Today, we'll introduce the major trade policy and strategic issues facing U.S., India, and global relations. Then in days 2 and 3, we'll dive into some of the specific topics and sectors where the 2 countries face challenges and opportunities to work together. Some reminders as we begin today's session. Your link for the seminar is good for all of today's sessions. If you get disconnected or need to log back off and get back on, the same link will work for all of today and should let you back into the live session. If for some reason you miss one of the sessions, we are recording it, so we will send the link around for that once the sessions have been completed. You can ask questions of our discussants using the Q&A tab on the Zoom screen. We encourage you to take advantage of this so that we have these great experts speaking with us today and for the next 2 days, and we hope to get to as many of those questions as we can. You should have received a little while ago, if you are registered on Zoom, an email with the agenda and panelist biographies so we can dispense with lengthy introductions before the start of each session. Today, we are joined by over 300 students from 300 guests from 19 different countries. And as you know, if you've watched any of our regular webinars, we like to call out the names of some of those you're in community with on Zoom, even if you can't see them on camera. So welcome today to Shamila Permal, the Minister of Economic Affairs at the High Commission of Malaysia in New Delhi. Nidia Ngao, Managing Director at the Bauer Group Asia in Singapore. Christopher Ash is a Director at the Office of South Asia at the International Trade Administration at the U.S. Department of Commerce. And Taylor Smith with Congresswoman Catherine Clark, excuse me. Welcome, Shamila, Nidia, Christopher, and Taylor, and welcome to all of you. I'd like to invite now our first panel to please turn on their cameras. While they're turning on their cameras, I'd like to remind everyone that today's session is being recorded on Tuesday, May 19th, starting at 9 a.m. U.S. Eastern Time. Things in the world change very rapidly these days, so if you're not watching this live, some of the issues we're discussing today may change by the time you watch this on a recording. Kicking off the entire seminar and to help us set the stage for the rest of the discussion, we have a fabulous panel. Welcome to Angela Ellard, who's a senior advisor, non-resident senior advisor at the Center for Strategic and International Studies and a former Deputy Director General of the World Trade Organization. Dr. Ajay Kumar is a Minister for Commerce at the Embassy of India in Washington, D.C. Rachel Rizzo is a Senior Fellow for the Strategic Studies Program, the Observer Research Foundation in Delhi. And our moderator today is Neena Shenai, who's a partner in the International Trade Investment and Market Access Practice at WilmerHale. She's a former senior advisor to the Assistant Secretary of the Bureau of Industry and Security at the U.S. Department of Commerce, former Trade Counsel in the House Ways and Means Committee, and a member of WIDA's Board of Directors. Neena?
Thank you so much, Ken, and thank you to WIDA for the invitation to be here. I'm just so pleased to be a part of this panel and part of this really rich and interesting U.S.-India WIDA seminar that's going to run over the next few days that Ken just outlined. I think this is just a very timely and important topic. And because the sessions through the conference include deep dives on a number of the issues Ken mentioned, whether it's trade policy, economic strategy, geopolitics, India's evolving role in the international trade system, this panel is going to be a scene setter of sorts to discuss India's strategic and economic priorities to tee up the rest of the discussions for the conference. And I'm just thrilled to be here with Angela and Ajay and Rachel for what we hope will be a really interesting conversation. Just a few words of introduction for our discussion on this panel. India has long sought its own path. The leader of the non-aligned movement in the 1960s and onwards, and selectively choosing how to enhance its relationships, its strategic partners, whether it's through the 2008 US-India civil nuclear deal, or even the conclusion of the long-awaited US-EU trade agreement earlier this year. India-US relations are really at a critical juncture at the moment. India has been subject to steep US tariff, both the IEEPA reciprocal tariffs for purchasing Russian oil, which took tariff rates up to 50% before being reduced to 18% in a framework deal in February, and further following the invalidation by the Supreme Court of the IEEPA tariffs. India has sought to renegotiate the terms of the deal that it has with the United States. I would say with all of this, there are significant opportunities that are possible with the US-India relationship. The US-India relationship, however, can't be looked at in isolation. India's relationship with countries like Russia, China are complex and are being directly affected by a host of geopolitical issues. So, we think about all the puts and takes, the conflict in Ukraine, the US-Iran war, impacts on energy markets. And India has also taken strong stands in the multilateral rules-based context, like at the WTO. It has sought to carve out policy space and its own positions for the last 25 years, which have had significant impacts on the WTO agenda, including recently on areas such as e-commerce, investment facilitation, and digital trade. In some ways, India has benefited from the chaos of our current world, but geopolitical issues have also shown how the country's international relationships remain integrally tied with issues beyond its borders. So with no further ado, I want to jump into questions of our panelists. So my first question, Ajay, if you can start, is there a new global economic order, and what are the key strategic drivers for India in its interactions with the world?
Neena, thank you so much for your introduction. And Ken, thank you for putting together this India dedicated seminar. Thanks to Vita for doing the India dedicated 3-day seminar first time. So we are very happy to see that how India is getting prioritized by Vita. And we hope that such interactions will be more often when it comes to India-US trade and commercial engagement as such, and as well as much wider India-US trade and strategic partnership. So that said, Neena, you are right. Basically, there has been all kind of challenges which our world is facing, our part of the world is facing, both the India and United States are facing. Basically, from my perspective, this seminar is extremely timely, as both India and the United States seeks to deal with excess industrial capacities in certain geographies. We have seen that how various multilateral organizations have not been delivering to the objectives or priorities which originally they were thought of, basically, and how these multilateral organizations have been cornered by a few. We have also seen large-scale distortions in the global supply chains. To bring the India perspective here, I would like to emphasize that India is trying to deal with these challenges while investing heavily in modernizing its physical infrastructure as well as digital infrastructure. All of you must have heard of this digital infrastructure on which India is trying to deliver large scale services to its citizens. We have also been prioritizing expanding manufacturing footprint of India in India as such. We are using or leveraging production linked incentive schemes to see how we can actually diversify the supply chains, how we can actually be plugging India to the global supply chains or global value chains. As well as we are also mindful of actually ensuring that how our carbon footprint is actually to an extent restricted. So we are also prioritizing green energy transition while promoting renewable energy, battery storage, as well as green hydrogen. While we are mindful that we are taking certain actions, we are also undertaking deep economic reform. While taking these economic reform, we are balancing growth and equity. That said, India's strategic and economic vision is to actually develop India by 2047. And this vision is coupled with the fact that we are promoting self-reliance. We are also trying to develop our own defense institutions, as well as it comes with much more younger, resilient Indian people which have self-confidence to reach the world, as well as a young population which is trying to actually consume more and more technology to align themselves with the world, basically. So that said, I'll pause here. Neena, if you have anything to add in this, or maybe other fellow panelists who are having a lot of expertise on trade issues. Thank you.
Thank you, Ajay. Angela, would you like to comment on this question as well?
Sure. Thank you, Neena. It's a great pleasure to be here with you and my fellow panelists. And of course, thanks very much to Ken and Diego, to WIDA and its sponsors for hosting this very important seminar. So your question relating to whether there's a new global economic order and how India fits into this and how the US-India relationship is affected by this. I would say that we're not facing so much a new global economic order as much as a rapidly changing and chaotic one in which the US is simply not acting as it used to and as countries expected that it would. And of course, that's to the frustration of many. But an alternative to the global economic order has not really yet emerged, and things are being pushed and pulled in different directions. The WTO, for example, is still relevant, but countries are using other tools and other ways to engage. And of course, India is very much in the midst of this and trying to find its path. India is, of course, a country of great contradictions, developing, of course, but accelerating in key areas, intensive poverty, but also leaping ahead, for example, in digital trade. The old world order has not served India. And it's very clear about that. And India has expressed, I think, a very strong sense that it's now its turn to set the rules. So what I see as the three strategic drivers in terms of of India and how it's approaching trade in the world order is that first, India is the largest democracy in the world. There is stability domestically with the BJP party and Prime Minister Modi in firm control, but significant poverty at home at the same time, which is always destabilizing and a huge priority. So that's the first strategic driver. Second is India's desire to industrialize. We're already seeing that, and Ajay laid out some very important examples. But alongside this desire to industrialize is the sense of common but differentiated responsibility, as India says quite often. In other words, the expectation that it's now its turn, and it should not have to change. It should have all the benefits to industrialize that the already industrialized world enjoyed, even though that may not have been good for the environment or for labor standards or for trade in general, human rights. And then finally, India is finding its own lane. It's not just allying with the US or with China. It's trying to forge its own path, as you said, Neena, in your introduction. And I think those are the strategic drivers for the US relationship with India, and that India is facing itself.
Thanks, Angela. And Rachel, do you want to comment on Ajay's and Angela's comments?
Yeah, absolutely. And I will second what everyone has already said. Thanks for having us. And it's really wonderful to be here alongside all of you. In terms of, your question about a new global order emerging and India's strategic priorities, first, I would say, the short answer is yes. A new global economic order isn't just emerging, it has emerged, although the shape of it is still taking place and it's happening in real time. I think this shift began really in earnest, I would say in the early 2000s. You had China's economic rise, you had this emergence of a multipolar world, you had evolving practices in multilateral cooperation, and that produced now what economists are calling the centrifugal era, where economic and geopolitical forces are actively exacerbating global fragmentation. So you had this brief unipolar moment, which is eroding away. It's giving way to a more fluid and multipolar order, and that's increasingly shaped by regional actors. And it's not driven by like a sudden collapse. It's a gradual and collective rise, I think, of new powers and the global South especially. Even at Davos in January of this year, Alexander Stubb from Finland framed this moment in the same breath as 1918, 1945, 1989, basically saying that this multilateral order that was created after World War II and was built in the image of the West now has to give meaningful agency to new actors. And I think that's really important. The other thing I'll say is, India's strategic positioning here, I like to call it the art of being indispensable to everyone in a way. India positions itself in this order, this new order. It's in a sophisticated way. It's rooted, as others have mentioned, in this idea of multi-alignment. And this is a deliberate and calibrated strategy that is qualitatively different from Cold War fence sitting. This is not fence sitting. It's a way for India to navigate great power competition without choosing sides. So what you have is India expanding ties with Europe, Japan, Australia on one hand. It has these time-tested relationships with Russia, on the other hand, alongside normalizing relations with China. And it can result in pretty striking optics. You had Prime Minister Modi visiting Russia twice in 2024, attending the SCO summit in China in 2025, hosting Putin last December, and then having von der Leyen and a major European delegation as chief guests at Republic Day for 2026. So it's really interesting to watch how India is strategically placing itself in this moment and seeing where it's going to go in the coming years.
Thanks, Rachel. And I love that phrase, the art of being indispensable to everyone. It's a great way to capture India's position in the world. Actually, on that front, let's shift a bit to actually U.S.-India relations specifically. And as Angela described, India's the largest democracy, and we often hear, the U.S. the world's oldest democracy. We should have important shared interests. We also have important divergences. And over the past year, we've seen U.S.-India issues dominated by trade and tariffs. Russia, as you mentioned, Rachel, Iran, they've all dominated the headlines. And so what's the sense these days? What is the current state of U.S.-India relations? And I'll throw in there also that we have a question from the audience just about the U.S.-India trade deal and the status of that deal. So Ajay, do you want to take this question first?
Absolutely. So Neena, once again, thank you, and thank you to panelists for bringing the expertise on India. Basically, I think some of the very important points which are being made by both Angela and Rachel. From my perspective, India and US are trusted partners. Our partnership has actually evolved for more than last 4 decades. This partnership is actually much more broad-based, supported by various political across the political aisle in both the countries. It has a huge support base from people of both the countries. So it's a great partnership. This partnership is actually touted as one of the most consequential partnerships of 21st century. This partnership is actually grounded in modern strategic priorities and realities of our 2 countries. This partnership is also based on democratic values, rule of law, which people of our countries actually really espouse for. From my perspective, basically, I think we are in the same boat when it comes to dealing with the challenges of trusted supply chains. Our partnership encompasses beyond just trade. This partnership is actually experiencing one of the strong defense side of it. Basically, all of you must have seen that both of our countries have been participating in defense exercises more and more. All of you must have seen that how India has been acquiring more and more defense systems, subsystems, and platforms from the United States because it also serves the long-term security interests. We are currently working on co-developing defense equipments and technology, basically. We have seen in the last 3 years or 4 years, and we are continuing with that momentum, basically, how our 2 countries are working closely on critical and emerging technologies. We have seen the strongest showing and participation both from the government side as well as from the US private sector during the recently held AI Impact Summit. We have also seen that how US companies has been taking the advantage of India's semiconductor moment. We have actually seen huge investments in semiconductor space. Again, if you all see that how Semicon 2.0 policy has come out or is in the shaping, basically, which is actually looking at supporting the entire semiconductor value chain, where a lot of opportunities are there for the US companies. And we are very very mindful of our partnership, since it creates value not just for India but for the United States and its private sector. That said, I think we have also seen that how India is trying to plug in with the rule-based global supply chains. And that said, we have always prioritized India-US trade partnership. For the last 3-4 years, we have been pushing for India-US free trade agreement. And with this current administration, we have been talking about bilateral trade agreement, and we are actively engaged with our US partners. And all of us has seen that how our Prime Minister as well as President Trump have announced the framework agreement early February this year. And recently our trade team was in town. We are deeply committed to our framework deal. And we are basically on the verge of making the final shape of it. Both the sides are working together. So it's not that India is trying to seek renegotiation of the contours of the deal. I don't think that's the correct manifestation as such. But at the end of the day, I can say that both of our trade teams are very closely working to finalize this BTA. That said, I'll pause here. I look forward to contributions from the other panelists.
Angela, would you like to also comment on the state of US-India relations?
Sure. Well, it's obviously a tremendously dynamic relationship. No doubt about that, not just now, but historically, when it comes to trade in particular. And I'll focus really more on the trade part of the relationship. So there's a lot of uncertainty, a lot of questioning of assumptions on both sides. And of course, there's the US-India framework deal that has been negotiated. It's a great start. There are a lot of blanks still to be filled in, as acknowledged within the document itself. And of course, Prime Minister Modi has referenced, as well as Minister Goyal, perhaps renegotiating or relooking at that agreement in light of the Supreme Court decision. But still, regardless of that Supreme Court decision and the effect on the IEEPA tariffs, the agreement is aimed at trying to cover a lot more than tariffs. So regardless of where we stand on tariffs itself, the agreement is an effort to try to resolve some of these longstanding issues. So there are a lot of blanks still to be filled in on non-tariff barriers, for example, and standards. I think the biggest blank relates to rules of origin, and the fact that that's still to be addressed. How do we determine whether products are of Indian origin, depending on what's in the supply chain? So this is something important, obviously, because it lets you know what kinds of products get the benefit of the agreement. So, you know, there are longstanding barriers. I remember from my days on the Hill, beef, dairy, almonds, that members of Congress raise. And I think it's very important in terms of how the US-India relationship and this agreement, in terms of making it as durable as possible, I think it's very important to involve Congress. Congress already is involved in raising constituent concerns, but I think a way of trying to formalize that engagement is very important. And then, of course, in addition to the agreement, we have the Section 301s on overcapacity and forced labor, possibly to replace the IEEPA tariffs. That still has to be resolved as those cases proceed. On the positive side of the equation, or the less uncertain side, I was really glad to see that the US and India resolved 7 WTO disputes in 2023. Long-standing disputes covering everything from steel, solar, export subsidies, poultry, many concerns. And I'm glad to see that those have been resolved. But lurking beneath the surface, of course, we still have plenty of other issues. And then finally, the Pax Silica agreement, that is, or framework that is being discussed right now. India is part of that, and I think in terms of critical minerals, India needs to be at the table for this, and I'm very glad to see that that India has joined. So there's a lot of uncertainty, a lot of competition. The U.S., India, as India moves ahead with other countries, it's something that the U.S. has to keep in mind as well.
Thanks, Angela. And then, as you pointed out, lots of uncertainty and competition in the relationship and on a whole slew of fronts that you and Ajay mentioned. Rachel, do you have further comments on this question?
Yeah, I would just add 2 quick things. In terms of the broad India-US relationship, it is one after Trump entered office for the second time that soured very quickly and then partially reset. And so everyone knows after you've gotten into a big fight with an ally or a partner, you're trying to make things better, but each side is kind of doing a careful dance around the other one, knowing that the relationship and the strength of the relationship is important for both sides to preserve. What I would say is that Russian oil remains a source of friction. So Washington uses tariffs not just as trade tools, but they're sanctions enforcement mechanisms. They're ways for the United States to get other states to bend to its will, whether they decide to or not. And demanding that India cut off its Russian crude purchases was the price of some of that relief, right? And especially when it came to tariffs. And so India hasn't officially confirmed any commitment to stop buying Russian oil. But I think it shows how difficult it is to enforce energy decoupling in a volatile market, especially when US military action against Iran disrupted Gulf energy supplies, and then Washington itself granted India a temporary waiver to resume Russian oil purchases. So that's one thing. And then the other thing I would say in terms of India building relationships, with or without Washington, there is much disagreement, I think, about whether or not Washington was the driver behind the, finalization of the EU-India FTA. I certainly think it was. Some speakers on your panels over the next few days might disagree with that. But I think, there's this strategic logic to the US-India relationship, especially, as the US sort of looks at India as an Indo-Pacific counterweight to China, that gives both reason sides to preserve it. But in the months in 2025, since this bilateral downturn, you had India sign free trade agreements with Oman, New Zealand, UK, the EU in early 2026. So I think what this shows is that New Delhi is building in optionality to its economic structure. It's not abandoning the relationship with the United States, certainly, but it's not treating it any longer as the anchor of its foreign economic policy.
Yeah, thank you, Rachel. And I actually want to bring both Ajay and Angela into this point on India and its diversified economic relationships, because we haven't yet talked in great detail. We've touched on it, but the WTO and India's views of the WTO, what India sees as the value of the WTO, in addition to these other relationships. Ajay, Angela, would you like to comment on this as well?
Absolutely. So maybe Angela can take this first. She has huge WTO expertise.
Well, sure. Thank you, Ajay. I'd be happy to jump in here. It's a very rich topic, and I know we're almost out of time. But I would say that, of course, India's relationship with the WTO is not easy. It seems to me that it's overarching objective is making sure that it has the policy space to be able to industrialize, to reduce poverty. It doesn't want to be constrained by rules that it sees as not to its benefit. What that has translated into is basically an all or nothing approach. And when I was there, I saw very little effort or intent to compromise or to negotiate. And I think that sells very well back home in India. But at the same time, I would argue that that's really only a short-term gain, and that India really has a lot to gain in the long term by being part of trying to find solutions. India is, of course, a natural leader of developing countries. But at the same time, many of them are frustrated by India's stance on many issues, including fish, including plurilaterals, such as the Investment Facilitation for Development Agreement, where India is the only member of the WTO that will not allow the agreement to be docked. There are also, in terms of India's stances on special and differential treatment for developing countries, India has divided the developing world. And I think this is really important as we see how the WTO continues and how it tries to address the concerns related to development, where we have this split now on various issues in the developing world. I think that as the US takes various actions within the WTO and outside, that perhaps members see the US as being less engaged, there's actually less incentive for India to step forward. Why be a hero if the atmosphere is not right for resolving issues with respect to the WTO? So I think it's important for the US to continue to engage and to engage productively and proactively so that others like India will take the signal and so show, we hope, some sign of compromise. I think we just have to get used to, however, the fact that India sees the WTO in a different way than others do. And it's not going to be possible to just change India's mind. And instead, members have to work with India to understand its needs and to show that their own priorities are actually priorities that India should have as well. I think that's the only way we can really get to compromise.
Thank you, Angela. Ajay, I want to give you a moment to respond to some of Angela's points.
Angela, thank you so much. I think you made a number of valid points, basically, and I think that's where our thoughts comes in, basically, because we really value the importance of WTO. We have been actively participating in WTO. Recently, our Commerce and Industry Minister, he led the delegation to WTO Ministerial, and delegation was actively trying to be constructive on various side of the WTO engagement. As we strongly believe that there is a growing acknowledgement globally that it is no longer working for everyone. Certain countries have taken the huge advantage of WTO as a regime, basically. So India continues to stress the importance of building a level playing field and fair competition. We have also called for comprehensive reform of WTO to enhance its functions. Reform remains essential if multilateralism is to remain relevant and effective in addressing contemporary challenges. India continues to be committed to WTO, and we are very positive to work with various countries, particularly with the United States, to see how WTO can be more meaningful and delivering to the advantage of each of our countries. Thank you.
Thank you, Ajay. And I want to thank you and Angela and Rachel for this really very interesting and spirited discussion. And we're very much looking forward to the rest of the conference. So let me turn this over to Diego.
Thank you so much. And thank you all very much for a terrific opening discussion to help us kick off the seminar. I wanted to jump on camera to first of all thank Ajay and the Embassy of India for their partnership and engagement in helping us launch this program. We really appreciate your support and collaboration along the way. Angela, thank you as always for sharing your insights and perspectives from your previous role at the WTO. Earlier this year, you helped us launch AWIDA's major series focused on the WTO and the future of the multilateral trading system. So we're especially grateful to continue part of that conversation with you today. Rachel, great to see you and host you once again on the platform, especially all things considered with the logistics earlier today. And of course, thank you to Neena for moderating today's conversation and for all of your support and leadership on the WIDA board. So with that, I'd now like to welcome our second panel and ask them to please turn on their cameras. We are now going to dive a little deeper into the bilateral relationship between the United States and India. And we really could not think of three better people to help lead this conversation. Today, we are joined by Brendan Lynch, Assistant U.S. Trade Representative for South and Central Asia at the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative, Anthony Rizzulli, Managing Director for North America at Albright Stonebridge Group, who most recently served as Director for India at the National Security Council and has over 2 decades of experience as a Foreign Service officer, including multiple postings across South Asia. And of course, our moderator and frequent commentator of WIDA's Friday Exchange podcast, Mark Linscott, Senior Advisor at the Asia Group and U.S.-India Strategic Partnership Forum, and former Assistant USTR for South and Central Asia, and Assistant USTR for WTO and Multilateral Affairs. Mark, over to you.
Thanks, Diego. It's great to be here. Now, this panel number 2 is all about the economic and trade relationship between the United States and India. But I actually think of it more in terms of the intersection of trade and economic with the strategic. It's a bit difficult to divorce the two. Now, my background is trade, and throughout my career at the U.S. Trade Representative's Office, USTR, India always featured prominently. Most of my career was multilateral, GATT, WTO, in Geneva. And to be frank, those experiences were generally pretty terrible, rarely good. I know that the next panel being moderated by Don Shackelford with Ignacio and Maria and John V will be getting into the depths of that issue. In fact, Angela and Ajay touched on those issues in the last panel. But at the very end of my career, I was focused on bilateral, in fact, working with Brendan on those issues, bilateral trade relationships with India. And those were so much better than the multilateral. I felt like we could get real traction on issues. There was give and take. We could have frank exchanges. It was just a very different kind of scenario than we had with the multilateral. Now, Brendan is a consummate India trade expert. He's been covering this for a really long time. I don't think there's anybody in the U.S. government or who's ever been in the U.S. government who has more experience on U.S.-India trade relationship. And it's not because he's a glutton for punishment. I think he's patient and he's a bit of a visionary in terms of the potential for that relationship. And, Anthony really does marry the economic with the strategic. And this is so important because one always impacts the other. So I'm going to start with Brendan because there's been so much anticipation of concluding an interim agreement. We have a framework, but the interim agreement has not yet been concluded. We've got the 301 developments. It's hard to say where all this would go, but I'd like to take a step back and ask you to provide a bit of a specific, a summary of the specific nature of the ambitions of a bilateral trade agreement, the BTA, which was agreed between Prime Minister Modi and President Trump only a few weeks after inauguration last year. It's a bit of a different approach than with most other trading partners with which the United States has been doing agreements on reciprocal trades or ARTs. I always find that I have to explain and emphasize this difference in my conversations. So I think it would be great to hear from you straight from the horse's mouth on, what is the BTA? What is that ultimate ambition?
Yeah, thanks, Mark. And, as you noted, I'm someone who's been working on the U.S.-India economic relationship for a long time now. So I'm really happy to be here and really happy that WIDA is putting on the event. But you raise a good question, and it's one that I get asked, quite often. The negotiations of a BTA are structured in a fundamentally different way than the agreements on reciprocal trade. But I think before kind of diving into some of the details, I think stepping back a little bit would be helpful. So I think there has been an interest, even going back to the first Trump administration, in negotiating something comprehensive in the trade space with India. And really, it's been a mutual interest. I mean, the Indian side has been as well. And we couldn't get there during the first Trump administration, but I think the leaders understood the importance of the relationship, both from a geopolitical and strategic perspective, but also from a practical one as well. I mean, I think both sides have clear interest in ensuring that the trade relationship continues to be enhanced. From India's perspective, the U.S. is its largest export market, one of its largest sources of FDI. From the U.S. perspective, I think the Indian market is one that's growing, has tremendous potential, but of course has been one that has been historically incredibly protected, right? High tariffs, significant NTBs, regulatory challenges, and getting to the kind of administration's priority, we have had a structural deficit with India because of those conditions of the protected market. So I think from the administration's view, negotiating a comprehensive agreement would be something that could address those concerns. But to your question, Mark, it is different because it is bilateral in nature. So we are, of course, going to be focusing on, in the interim agreement, getting concessions and, market access liberalization and addressing NTBs that will start to rebalance the trade relationship and reduce that deficit. But I think one of the critical components of the BTA is that we are also negotiating rules-based chapters that are bilateral in nature. And these are cross-cutting, similar to some of our historical trade agreements. And I think the view on both sides is that these will be mutually beneficial. And, from my perspective, something that really will ensure stability in the trading relationship going forward. So these are going to require systematic reforms in India that I think will help benefit the Indian economy, but also help continue to balance the trade relationship. But the key piece is that these are bilateral in nature, and so it's much different than the arts that we've been negotiating with other countries. Again, the interim agreement is just going to be a subset of kind of the broader BTA that we do expect to be continuing to negotiate really over the course of the coming years. So hopefully that explains kind of the difference between the two.
Yeah, that's really helpful, and I think during the course of this discussion, we may get into some of the meat associated with BTA. But I want to shift gears a bit and bring Anthony into the picture. I mean, Diego, you highlighted Anthony's rich career, many years at the State Department. He was in the embassy in Delhi and also at the National Security Council. So Anthony, I wonder if you can give us a bit of the quick and dirty of how the strategic and economic relationship has evolved over, let's say, the last decade plus. I always found, even when I was at USTR, I'd get really confused about all the acronyms going on. The State Department and NSC was doing. There were always multiple configurations. So it'd be great to get your take on just the general upward trajectory in that relationship, including the fairly regular ups and downs. We've seen those definitely. We've had a bit of a roller coaster with the Trump 2.0 administration. So what's your take?
Thanks, Mark, and thanks for the question, and great to be with you and Brendan, and thank you to WITA for the invitation to join the session. I'll be really brief in the overview of the trajectory of the strategic partnership, but I'll go back 2 decades, but I promise I'll be brief, and then offer some reflections on that history and where we are now, and I'll try to go light on the acronyms. Look, the modern strategic partnership, as we understand it today, arguably dates to the next steps in the strategic partnership framework, which launched in 2004 under George W. Bush. This was a framework to expand bilateral cooperation in civil nuclear, civilian space, and high-tech trade. In 2006, the US and India concluded the historic civil nuclear agreement, the 123. And the implementation of that deal, the NSG exception, India's accession to the non-pro regimes, that was a huge diplomatic lift for the United States. And its approval by Congress, including non-proliferation champions like then Senator Biden, underscored the bipartisan support for a future-oriented strategic partnership with India. Now, we never realized the potential of civil nuclear commerce, though we still might, but that agreement enabled progress across a vast range of bilateral and strategic cooperation, including defense. The audience should remember that before this process took off, India had been under sanctions for nuclear testing, and strategic cooperation was almost nil. Distrust was high, and there was a lot of leftover Cold War baggage to unpack. Yet, by 2023, we could write into the Modi-Biden state visit joint statement that no corner of human endeavor was untouched by the US-India strategic partnership, and it felt that way. By one count, by 2020 or so, I think we had more than 40 dialogues, these are what you were referring to, and working groups across the interagency. Some were more effective than others. Indeed, some of the commercial working groups, including the CEO Forum, they didn't always deliver the outcomes we had hoped, but they helped build connectivity and lent balance to the partnership, which helped ensure that no one issue, even the disagreements we had with India and the UN or the WTO, could overturn the sort of broader trajectory, the broader progress we were making. And it needs to be emphasized that people-to-people ties were really the foundation of this relationship, a foundation that was being built across US business, science, and academia well before the strategic partnership really lifted off. In my view, this is a key aspect of the relationship that deserves more consideration as we look ahead and as US policies change. So, notwithstanding some rocky periods in the relationship, the trajectory of the bilateral partnership was upwards, and it was bipartisan. Indeed, the first Trump administration got strategic trade authorization tier 1 done for India, which probably did more for US-India tech trade than just about any other measure. Biden built on Trump 1.0 momentum, elevating the Quad to a summit, but also in tech cooperation. The Initiative on Critical and Emerging Technology, the so-called ISET, was about building an even more comprehensive framework for a trusted technology partnership, including technology trade, which enabled even bigger steps forward in space, defense, clean energy, university partnerships, and much more. So to wrap up, to wrap up the answer to your question and bring us to where we are today, the shortcomings of ISET and previous frameworks for strategic cooperation, if there were any, was that the trade and investment partnership did not always have a strong strategic dimension to it, which I've always appreciated our cooperation on our consultation, Mark and Brendan, just because I think both of you have always understood that aspect. Bilateral trade and investment between the US and India grew, especially in services, but the gov element of the economic partnership sometimes felt less dynamic than the strategic element, even though they were obviously linked. And we must acknowledge that even the ISET process, for all its good work, didn't do as much as we would have liked to move the needle on the market access and regulatory barriers to trade and investment, things that must be addressed if India is truly to emerge as a trusted and reliable partner for global supply chain resilience and diversification. So that's the optimism I draw from the negotiations between the two sides on a BTA. And that was the journey from the US side upwards, with strong support from both parties and a whole generation of experts, including you both, who pushed this partnership forward because presidents from George W. Bush onwards made clear that it was a priority. And, the partnership between the oldest and largest democracy in the world should be the defining partnership of this century, and I still think that's true.
Well, I think you've both brought us up to speed on where we are now. Brendan specifically on the trade front, Anthony on the real interaction of the economic side with these strategic. But now we have a lot of new circumstances. Prime Minister Modi last week did a bit of a pep talk to the nation, essentially responding to some of the economic pressures associated with conflict in West Asia between the United States and Iran. Frankly, it seems like India's moved in, like many other countries, moved into a bit of a crisis mode. Moody's also just forecast, or in fact reduced its forecast for economic growth in India from 6.8% to 6% for 2026. That's a big drop. I mean, economic growth in India, when it gets to the 6% level, it's clearly not enough for its long-term aspirations. So, Anthony, I'll start with you. What are the implications for U.S.-India relationships for the relationship in these present circumstances, particularly given that the United States precipitated the crisis and is facing some challenges in winding it down? Will we see business as usual in strategic coordination, in continuation of bilateral cooperation under the Compact and the trust initiatives and next steps in the Quad? And for Brendan, are there any implications for the interim agreement? And the interim agreement is still pending. We've had a war that's been, that has started while we've been waiting for that interim agreement to conclude. So might there be implications for that or for the broader bilateral trade agreement? And Prime Minister Modi has made it clear that the nation is doubling down on Make in India and seeks to increase the values of foreign imports, particularly given some of the developments in the current account. So, Anthony, I'll start with you.
Thanks, Mark. It's still difficult for me to discern how this conflict will ultimately impact bilateral relations. I mean, India's done a pretty good job of balancing its relations historically across the region, and compared to many other Asian countries, it has considerable economic resilience and diplomatic heft to sort of manage this crisis. But it's undeniably having an impact on India's economy and the livelihoods of ordinary Indian citizens. So we'll have to see. For the partnership, I think it's important to ask, though, how's the dialogue been with India? Are we consulting on our approach in Iran? I mean, key to the strategic partnership I described previously was our regional consultations. India is a partner, and it is obviously deeply affected by actions we take in the Persian Gulf, and in the Indian Ocean, of course. So close consultation is important. Without it, you lose trust. Some calls and visits have happened, and Secretary Rubio is traveling to India at the end of the month for a Quad foreign ministerial. So I'm sure there will be discussions, but I think that's very important. Beyond the Iran war, I think it's fair a year and a half in to assess where we are on the strategic partnership today. And I don't think we've made as much progress as we might have expected based on what the first Trump administration's strong track record was. Compact and trust are fine as framings. They track with the previous administration's eye set, maybe even expand upon it. But I don't see much evidence of progress on that complicated and important agenda. That said, we do have, thanks to Brendan and the USTR in particular, and a framework. We have a framework now for a bilateral trade agreement, and that a comprehensive bilateral trade agreement. And that, I think, does offer scope to help advance a broader strategic agenda, including on technology trade, AI investment, and much more. So I'm encouraged by that. But much as we needed the economic partnership to keep pace with the strategic partnership, I don't know if a trade agreement on its own can carry enough water, provide enough ballast for the strategic partnership as a whole to continue its upward momentum. Trust is essential, and you have to work to earn it across the board.
So, Brendan, well, any perspectives on what Anthony laid out, but then more specifically on the interim agreement and the BTA?
Yeah, I think I mean I agree with what Anthony, how he portrayed things. I think I do think across both governments, the level of trust and the engagement between the bureaucracies over the course of previous administrations has really strengthened the relationship. And so we are in a bit of a rocky time period, both because of the war in the Persian Gulf, also because of some of the tariff actions that were taken last year. But I think, the relationships since I started working on the portfolio have really expanded throughout the government. And so, yes, I do think to Anthony's point, there is more to do across the strategic relationship. But from a trade perspective, I mean, we are at a historic moment, right? And I think in the near future, I don't see the strain in terms of energy markets or the impact of that the war is having on India's economy. I don't really see there being a large potential of that derailing our negotiations. That being said, things can happen, and if the economy really does take a big hit, the political narratives can certainly change. But I also think, India understands that they need to maintain their position in the U.S. market, right? And so if we can't conclude the interim agreement and really move on to the broader components of the BTA, there's a risk, and there's a risk in terms of tariffs coming into effect that may negatively impact their position in the U.S. market. So I think even if there are some political challenges based on kind of the state of the economy, they don't want to make that situation worse by creating a situation where they're at a disadvantage in the U.S. market and their exports get hit in a manner that was similar to how they did late last year for a period of time. So, again, political narratives can change quickly in this situation, but right now I don't see it having a big impact on our ability to conclude the interim agreement.
Which is really good to hear. I'm hopeful. I continue to tell people I'm bullish. I'm sticking with I'm betting on this getting done. It's challenging across the trade policy front. This isn't unique to India. It's a dynamic with many other countries at this point in time within a short period of time over the last year and not even a half. We've had kind of multiple actions and reversals of actions on tariffs. We had Liberation Day. We had tariffs being imposed. We've had the 232 tariffs. We've had Supreme Court decision. We've had temporary tariffs put into place under Section 122. We had a CIT decision on that, and prospects for 301. And it's that our trading partners are reacting in many respects to, or they're trying to anticipate, what comes next. And Brendan, I think you laid that out very well in terms of there are going to be tariffs down the road. 122 is clearly a stopgap before 301 actions come into place. But and maybe this is a question for Anthony. What are you seeing in terms of how a lot of countries, and then specifically India, is trying to anticipate on the strategic and the trade and economic front? Are they just buckling down and kind of hoping for the best and looking ahead to changes over time? Or are they, really determined to kind of get a certain trade structure in place for the immediate future? How do these circumstances kind of affect ongoing negotiations and agreements that are already agreed and yet to be implemented? And then more specifically, your reaction to kind of what Brandon laid out on the interim agreement and the BTA.
Thanks, Mark. Well, I'm also bullish. And as I mentioned in my earlier remarks, I think this was an element that had been missing from the strategic partnership. Part of that was sort of, I think, some of the drag that had came from the WTO and the challenges that Angela spoke about and that you've spoken about there in the multilateral context. This was an important element that needed to be addressed. And I had always had optimism that at some point we could sort of bring in, for example, the Trade Policy Forum into the Initiative on Critical and Emerging Tech and perhaps having more strategic trade policy with India. I mean, we had a strategic policy, a trade policy, and we were having trouble sort of advancing those. And that would be a means to address some of the things that India wanted, particularly on technology trade. I mean, we had leverage. We just needed to sort of widen, I think, the aperture about how we were thinking about our strategic partnership, because this was in India's interest and in our interest insofar as we believed it was important for India to emerge as a trusted partner and for a diversified supply chain, particularly vis-a-vis China, even if we weren't going to be explicit about that. I don't see India sort of just buckling down. I do, further to Rachel's point in the first session, they're obviously moving quite ambitiously to diversify their trade and investment relationships. And so they've cut trade deals. They're not as comprehensive as an ideal US-India FTA might be, but they're pretty comprehensive and they're obviously pretty substantial on the market access side. And both India and its partners, who I think also look at India the same way India may be looking at other partners, European Union and the UK, Canada, are also prepared to compromise here, given the changing circumstances around the world. So I think that's an element of it. But what I also heard from Indian officials is that they remain committed to trying to advance the US-India strategic partnership. And so when the foreign secretary had come, I think about a month ago, I had the opportunity to participate in a chat with him. And we talked about the trade agreement, and they see optimism there, including for the economic security piece, which is, one of the objectives for the longer term BTA. But clearly, they still want trust and compact to move forward. Those are good frameworks, and they want to see progress taken. And I'm sure, much as they've been prepared to take steps on the trade side, they would be prepared to take steps on the strategic side as well. But it takes a lot of engagement, and these are, for better or worse, they're not decisions that can be made, strictly at the top. Some are, but you do need it does take a sort of, I don't like the words bureaucracy, but it takes an effort on both sides to advance some of this cooperation. And perhaps it's distraction, perhaps it's sort of lack of personnel, but I'm still hopeful that over the next couple of years, there'll be more, attention paid to this, and we'll see the partnership in a stronger place than we came into it.
So, yeah,
Mark,
Brandon,
maybe I'll just jump in. I know you mentioned
Yeah,
kind of at the start of your question the numerous trade policy changes that have been kind of thrown at foreign partners by the U.S. government over the course of the last year. I just wanted to make kind of one response to that. I think, yes, there has been some kind of confusion amongst partners, but in the end, I think there is an interest in ensuring India's comparative advantage in the U.S. market, right? So I don't think the Indian government really cares what statutory authority USTR is using when it comes to tariffs. It's more about ensuring that they can continue to keep building the trade relationship and keep expanding their position in the U.S. market. That's really the key. Now, obviously for us, India needs to in order to provide that type of assurance, India needs to liberalize their market and ensure the trade deficit is going to come down, right? Through a number of different components, whether that's tariff elimination, addressing non-tariff barriers, purchase commitments, others, other types of areas that we're negotiating on. But that's really the kind of the key dynamic. So despite some of the fluctuations in kind of the trade tools that we've been using, India's perspective is that it's really about just ensuring comparative advantage for them.
Yeah, that's a huge point. I'm glad you emphasize that. We do have a question, and I think it feeds into to a bigger question. I encourage members of the audience to use the Q&A function for any additional question. We've got probably another 10 minutes or so. The question relates to what kinds of challenges do U.S. tech firms face in the Indian market? And my immediate response was like, look at the National Trade Estimates report. and even past NTE reports. And there are a number of barriers that are highlighted in that. But Brendan, if you can give us kind of a feel for those, and then more broadly, bringing out the crystal ball and looking ahead to there being an interim agreement in place and moving into the next phases of the bilateral trade agreement. Again, this is different from the ARTs being negotiated with other countries. What might be the pacing and the modality for those next phases of the BTA? Do you move into phase 2 and then get results on those matters, whether it's government procurement, although I could imagine that being phase 3 or phase 4, or intellectual property rights, or digital trade, which is relevant to the question. Those get implemented, and then you move to phase 3. I mean, how might that work going forward?
Yeah. So to start on the question related to kind of tech company challenges, I think, Mark, you're right. You can get a pretty comprehensive look or understanding of that by looking at the NTE. But there are some specific examples. I mean, if you look at it, it depends on kind of whether you're looking at the digital side or the hardware side, right? I think on the hardware side, it's kind of more traditional barriers that tech companies face. It's import licensing requirements, high tariffs, technical standards, and conformity assessment and testing requirements. All of those can be burdensome for tech suppliers trying to enter into the Indian market. On the digital side, there are also other concerns. I mean, certainly in the e-commerce space and others. But I think one kind of overarching theme that I think is important, that this applies to the tech sector, but also, well, every sector really, is policy uncertainty. Things in the Indian regulatory environment change rapidly, and they make doing business challenging in the Indian market. So one thing we are looking to negotiate as part of the BTA is, commitments on good regulatory practices, which would ensure more policy stability in the Indian market, which again, I think would be mutually beneficial, both for US companies and US exporters, but also for the Indian economy overall. So that's just a couple initial thoughts there. In terms of the next question, in terms of how this is going to play out going forward. So early on, which I should have mentioned at the beginning, when the leaders did launch the BTA, we quickly negotiated kind of the terms of reference of the BTA, which was really the scope in terms of what's going to be included. We were talking and tabling proposals and figuring out the scope of the negotiation, even getting into market access negotiations quickly. All of that happened even before the reciprocal tariffs were announced, right? So India was an early mover and was very proactive early on, which was fantastic and I think warranted and did position them well. But once we, assuming we do get past and conclude the interim agreement, which really is focused on kind of market access, non-tariff barriers, some of the econ security pieces that Anthony mentioned, purchase commitments, again, things that are really going to have an impact on the deficit itself, but likely some others as well. I don't want to rule other pieces out. We do then have to kind of revert back to kind of the broader scope of the BTA. We've started negotiations on certain chapters that we identified within that scope. There are others where we haven't even gotten to yet. So I do see a situation where we could be having multiple tracks, right? We have some chapters where we are, moving quickly, and those can be concluded on a shorter term track. But then we have others, Mark, like you mentioned, government procurement. That's going to be a challenge, right? And so it could happen in kind of multiple phases. In the end, I think the interim agreement kind of sets the baseline, and then we're going to build off of that, and hopefully we can move to conclude chapters across a number of different components of the relationship that are part of the broader BTA. And from my perspective, this will probably be a political decision in the end, right? In terms of how we want to choreograph, finalizing additional components of the negotiation. But from my perspective, if we do close chapters, in some areas that were, easier, let's say, I would want to see those get implemented as quickly as possible, right? So we will have to make some strategic decisions about what that looks like, though, in terms of kind of when there is a sufficient package of additional chapters and commitments that we can utilize and harvest and really get implemented. So we're going to have to see how the negotiations on each of the components of the BTA progress once we get past the actual interim agreement.
So we're actually got a couple more questions and just a few minutes left. I don't know how much time we've got to get into those, but in fact, they both relate to China, and there is the bigger question of, and this gets to your point, Brendan, about comparative advantage. What is happening between the United States and China broadly, and then specifically on trade. I know that India and Indian stakeholders have been looking over their shoulders about what the United States might do with China and how does that impact their interest, their access to the U.S. market. There's a specific question about there being reference from USTR and Secretary Bessent about possibility of lowering or eliminating tariffs on low-end consumer goods from China. And if that were to happen, what does that mean for Indian apparel and home goods in terms of that comparative advantage? I mean, will those possibly be negotiated with India as well? And then there was the bigger question of supply chains and diversifying away from China. How does the summit last week potentially impact that question? Because India, like so many other countries, does want to be more than just a +1. It wants a lot of investment moving from other parts of the world, and particularly China, into India, and that the U.S.-India relationship can help to cement that. But let's bring in this China element. Anthony, why don't we go back to you, and then maybe we can finish up with Brendan. And we've got literally 2 minutes.
All right. I mean, look, the U.S.-India relationship is sometimes viewed almost exclusively through a China prism. I think that's a bit reductivist, and I don't think that was the implication of the question, or the insinuation in the question. But the convergence around China and the China challenge was clearly something, representative sort of point of strategic alignment for the U.S. and India. So lower tariffs from China, if that's where we ended up for China on certain consumer goods, I think would really hurt trust between the U.S. and India if that's where we landed. Obviously, with the implications for the trade agreement, the interim trade agreement would be substantial. I would have to imagine Brendan would probably have greater thoughts on that. Diversifying supply chains from China. Obviously, India has the size and scale to play a significant role in that regard. It doesn't want to just be a +1, you're right. But here, I think the U.S. has to conclude or agree that that's a goal worth pursuing. That was somewhat explicit in the ISET. It's less explicit today, I believe, though I do think the steps that the USTR is leading on the trade agreement, addressing the regulatory barriers and policy uncertainty that Brendan talked about, could actually advance that very goal. But I don't feel the administration has been particularly explicit about wanting India to be in that position, given the focus on market access strictly. So, hope I wasn't too long.
No, that's perfect. And Brendan, we'll give you the final word, because there is a specific aspect to one of those questions that directly involve the negotiations.
Yeah, I mean, I can't get into the negotiations we've been having with China because that's out of my portfolio. But I will say it could have an impact on our negotiations. It certainly will impact if we do offer some type of tariff concessions. India is going to be watching those closely, and we'll expect to get at least those same concessions, right? Now, India also needs to take actions to address concerns of the U.S. in order to warrant the consideration of those, potential concessions on our side. But I do think, generally speaking, Anthony touched on this a bit. There is an interest in seeing, India be part of the trusted supply chain and to diversify our trade. And I think that is happening to a degree, but a number of the things that we are trying to negotiate with India in terms of the bilateral commitments that are part of the BTA, I believe would further that, right? It would make India a more attractive investment location. And that's where India has had trouble in attracting investment because of the lack of stability in the regulatory environment. So I think there is a prospect for that, but I think India has frankly not taken advantage of the opportunities that have been out there when companies are looking at different markets to invest in.
Well, I want to conclude here, turn it over to Diego, but I thank both of you. It's been great. I mean, I worked with both of you. I think this is a real reflection. We talked about trust between the United States and India, between specific agencies and ministries in the United States with their counterparts in India. But I think this is a real reflection, this conversation, of the trust that has built up over time among U.S. agencies working on some of these issues, USTR and NSC and state. We each had our respective positions, and I think that has been generally a good story. It changes administration to administration, but that's generally been a positive story. And having you both here with those different backgrounds, I think, is a reflection of that. So over to you, Diego.
Thank you, Mark. Yeah, and I think that the blend of expertise and backgrounds that you all brought were super helpful for helping us understand the relationship. And Brendan, Anthony, thank you again for a terrific discussion. We certainly will be covering India and U.S. trade relations more under our WIDA International umbrella. So thanks again for joining us. And Mark, thank you again. So now we're going to zoom out a bit and move toward a broader discussion on India and the global trading system, including India's role at the WTO, its approach to other trade initiatives, and how it's positioning itself in an increasingly complex global economic and geopolitical environment. We're very fortunate to have an outstanding group joining us from all over the world for this final discussion of the day. So please welcome on Ignacio Garcia Bercero, Senior Fellow at Bruegel and former Director for Strategy, Multilateral Affairs, and Economic Analysis at DG Trade. Maria Pagan, former Deputy U.S. Trade Representative and U.S. Ambassador to the WTO. And Janvi Tripathi, Associate Fellow in the Geoeconomics Program at the Observer Research Foundation. And of course, our moderator, Don Shackelford, President at Looking Glass Trade and former Executive Director for Trade Agreements, Policy, and Negotiations at the Department of Commerce, and former Assistant USTR for WTO and Multilateral Affairs, and also another frequent commentator on trade issues that joins us regularly for our weekly Friday exchange. For those that haven't listened and are new to the WIDA platform, the Friday exchange is available on Apple, Spotify, and YouTube and released every Friday. So with that, Don, I will turn it over to you.
Great. Thanks so much, Diego. Pleasure to be here. And thanks to all the panelists for joining us. I've been listening in. I think others have as well. And it's been a great session so far this morning. We'll try not to repeat anything that has been already touched upon, but this session is meant to explore India's role in the WTO and the broader multilateral trading system, its engagement in bilateral and plurilateral initiatives, and its trade relationships with the EU, Indo-Pacific partners, and the Global South. That's a lot, so we'll try and see what we can get to. Just to touch on a few of these issues to set the stage. So multilaterally, India is traditionally known as being fairly non-aligned. This is a policy that they have across their government, and they're generally willing to be the lone holdout. We heard this from Angela during the first session, and we saw a bit of this in Cameroon with India being a holdout on the plurilateral negotiations on an investment facilitation agreement. They are also a holdout on plurilateral agreements generally at the WTO, even though there are GATT Article 4 agreements like the government procurement agreement that are very well established. But it's been challenging because of India's position to get new plurilateral agreements at the WTO because of India's stance. But it is also interesting that India was not the lone holdout on the e-commerce moratorium that was also discussed in Cameroon. And also, interestingly, India has concluded multiple free trade agreements in recent years. We saw starting out with Mauritius in 2021, Australia in 2022, along with the UAE, EFTA in 2024, the United Kingdom in 2025, along with Oman, the EU and New Zealand in 2026. And these agreements were literally decades in the making. So there's definitely some type of shift going on here. So let's dig into some of the details of what is happening in India's trade policy, because there's something new happening, even if we are still seeing some of the old in terms of holding on to the policy space and some of the WTO discussions, but there's movement here that we're seeing as well. So Angela and Ajay I think, already did a great job kind of discussing India's interest in maintaining policy space and development flexibility at the WTO. But on the e-commerce moratorium, for example, I'm going to pick on Maria first here. India has often been very cautious about new WTO disciplines on e-commerce, and their position seems to be evolving. As we saw out of the ministerial in Cameroon, it was actually Brazil and Turkey. It's now just Brazil that are really the holdouts. What is happening here? And feel free to talk about other engagements with India in terms of plurilaterals and otherwise, given your perch as the U.S. ambassador to the WTO and how you engaged with them.
Well, thank you, and it's great to be here. So digging right in. I mean, I find it interesting what happened at Cameroon, particularly on the e-commerce moratorium. In a way, not surprising because they didn't have to play the spoil sport because there were two other members, Brazil and Turkey, doing that. So, and even if you go back to the prior ministerial, MC13, they were doing their usual holding out on the moratorium, but then, we're very magnanimous to say, but, we're doing this for our great friends from the UAE, and therefore, we're not going to hold back. And then it was another member, Indonesia, who played the spoil sport towards the end. Even over the years, and even before I was in Geneva, obviously I was at USTR and dealing through you and others on India issues and having to figure out how do we get around India, for example, in the TFA and the Trade Facilitation Agreement. You wonder whether there's two thoughts, right? One, it's just tactical because it's just a chip to use for the thing that they say they really care about, which is on agriculture and the public stockholding, and which, if people don't know what that is, I'm not going to go into great detail, but basically it's a flexibility that they got. I'm totally blanking out when it was. It was one of the other ministerials in Africa, right? And
Bali.
In Bali, sorry. And now they want more flexibilities for basically being able to break the commitments that they made under the Agreement of Agriculture, but park that to the other side. So and a lot of things that they do, one of the earlier panelists, Rachel Rizzo, called it the art of being indispensable. This morning as I was thinking about it, I was thinking about, they're very influential, and they're influential in moving things forward, and they're influential in preventing things from moving forward. So maybe the art of being indispensable is a good way to talk about it. And the two things that come out, that I'm always having in my head is it because everything is a chit to trade for PSH, for members' agreements to their demands and PSH? Then the other thing that you hear about a lot, and this is part of what they say about plurilaterals and new issues, because the moratorium, the e-commerce moratorium, is not a plurilateral. I mean, the idea is that it's a multilateral agreement among all the members. That's the way it's been done. Is they don't want any new issues. So they don't want new issues until the old issues are taken care of, meaning PSH policy space. And they don't want plurilaterals also allegedly because that contravenes the notion of the WTO being a multilateral arrangement. And so they just want to focus on the multilateral. But of course, as you mentioned, and as we all know, the WTO does contain plurilateral agreements from the beginning. And it is a way to move forward. So maybe I'll wrap this part up by saying, I do wonder, if you don't want any new issues, but you say you want them to keep the multilateral trading system multilateral, so no new plurilaterals or new issues, then you're looking at a very stagnant organization. And when the WTO is being faced with criticism that is no longer fit for purpose, how does that fit into a narrative that you are defending the system or protecting the system? And so maybe I'll wrap it up there for now.
Thanks, Maria. Knowing that Ignacio has also negotiated with India at the WTO and on some of these, whether it's e-commerce moratorium or the plurilaterals or public stock holding, and just one thing about the e-commerce moratorium versus the public stockholding for food security. Anybody who's ever been to Bangalore will know that India has an interest in the e-commerce moratorium. So there does seem to be a bit of a self-defeating policy on the e-commerce moratorium there. But that aside, Ignacio, I'd love to get your take on some of these more specific WTO issues that India is very involved in.
No, thanks a lot, Donna. It's really great to have this opportunity to talk about India here. Let me try to take a little bit of a step back because I have been engaged in discussions with India multilaterally for quite some time. Now, the way that India has been behaving in the WTO since the WTO was created has been very nicely described by Angela and more recent experiences by Maria. A fundamentally defensive position, focus on policy space, against plurilaterals, against introducing any new issues in the WTO agenda. I still have the memory about the India negotiating position during the Uruguay round, because that was my first job when I joined the Commission. And it was a totally different India. I mean, of course, India was a very hard negotiator. It was a very strong defender of the interests of developing countries. But at the same time, it was a key constructive player that was very much instrumental in all the key trade-offs that had to be done during the Uruguay round negotiations. And I think that happened because this was the time when India was undertaking the first opening of its economy. And they saw the interest from that point of view of having the rules that would support their process of opening. Now, for a number of different complex political reasons, that was not the way that India reacted once the WTO was created. And my sense is that what we are now witnessing is the second opening of the Indian economy. It's mainly being driven by this comprehensive free trade agreement that India is now negotiating. And I think, in my view, India is also beginning to realize that if they want to further develop themselves as a major exporter, both on services and manufacture, they need to have a more stable and more predictable global trading environment. And that is not going to be provided only by free trade agreements. Free trade agreements is at the center of their strategy, and India is a very conservative country. It takes a lot of time for them to change their doctrine. But I think there's beginning to be a realization in India that that's not enough, and that they probably have also an interest of moving towards a slightly more offensive, forward-looking positions on WTO discussion. Now, I mean, I'm not inventing this. I'm not, if you actually follow a little bit the political debate in India and the different analyses that have been done in India on the outcome of NC14, including, for instance, some of the best Indian think tanks, like Indian Council for Research on International Economic Relations, there's increasingly the argument being made that India needs to shift to a much more offensive. It needs to be much more actively engaged in plurilateral discussions. It's obvious that they have an economic interest on the e-commerce moratorium. It doesn't make any sense from the Indian economic point of view to be defensive, to be an obstacle on the issues like e-commerce. It's something that is fundamentally in their economic interest to have global rules. And quite frankly, on issues like investment facilitation, it's really impossible to explain politically why India has put itself into the hole that it has actually put itself. It is also a very negative signal on investment, and India needs to be able to attract investment more than anything else. But, at the same time, India is not a country that likes to be cornered. And actually, if actually seeing that the political pressure is being put on them to isolate them is not necessarily going to be the best way to get India to respond. I personally would advise to my colleagues in the European Union that still have to engage with India, the new WTO ambassador who has joined there a few weeks ago, and the new Director General for Trade that would start working from the 1st of June, to be patient and to dedicate time to engage in the dialogue with India, because in my view, sooner or later, India will realize that it's in their interest to achieve to a different type of attitude in the WTO. Now, this is an element of bargaining, as Maria has been seeing, although quite frankly, I really find it very difficult to understand what real objective India is now pursuing by always putting PSH at the center of its agenda. I mean, it doesn't make sense from the economic point of view either. But this being said, I mean, India would need to come to these conclusions at its own rhythm. And I noticed that even on an issue like investment facilitation, there were some interesting signals that they actually gave already at MC14 and immediately MC14, that their position was beginning to change, because what they traditionally have been saying is that investment does not belong in the WTO, it's outside the mandate of the WTO. Now, what they're currently saying is a little bit different. It's not that they are saying that we are opposed per se to having investment in the WTO, but before you integrate this multilateral agreement, you need to have legal guardrails to ensure that the interests of non-participants are actually protected. I think there is some signals of potential opening there, and in my view, one would really like to try to see to what extent this can be a basis for India to begin to move forward a bit more on their on their WTO agenda, because it really does not make sense in terms of their own economic interests of India at this point in time.
Thank you, Ignacio. So kind of a refocus of India on what really should be its own economic interests. John B., from your perspective in India, working, I think, with government representatives there, I think it would be super helpful to hear from you on, is this India seeing kind of are we seeing a second opening of India's economy, as Ignacio points out? And is there a movement on India's position on public stock holding for food security, or on investment facilitation, or on the e-commerce moratorium, on any of the issues that you are focused on the WTO? Would love to get your perspective.
Thank you, Dawn, for that very wide question. And it's good to hear the perspective of others on what they are perceiving as India's view or India's position, and how it is being perceived elsewhere. But just, one at a time, on the GSIs. Legally speaking, and based on the rules, the GSIs differ from WTO plurilaterals in three key ways. Traditional plurilateral discussions started with the consensus mandate. The GSIs never had a consensus mandate, first of all. Secondly, the GSIs, probably to their credit, are open for anyone to join at any point in time, right? They're not constrained. The plurilaterals started as constrained discussions and stay constrained discussions. And ascending to those constrained discussions is a very difficult process for later. And thirdly, and more importantly, I feel, they're only subject to voluntary arbitration. They're not subject to DSB rules. They are not subject to appellate body governance. And that is, in my view, a critical failing of the GSIs, because when we're discussing agreements at the WTO, without the relevant checks and balances, they account for nothing except for best endeavor initiatives. We will try to do this, we will hope to do this, we will try and achieve so-and-so amount of liberalization. It's all well and good on paper. It's great to move the trade agreements needle forward. It's good to have these discussions. The WTO is the right place to have these discussions. GSIs are the wrong format to have these discussions. And that has been India's position, always. Coming to that, the DSB, I've already brought it up. The fact that more effort is put on how much India is blocking new issues, while we are not fixing one of the three key pillars of the WTO, which is the dispute settlement body, is a travesty. We've been discussing WTO reform for a while. We have been putting proposals on the table. Some of the naysayers of the GSIs are party to these discussions. The fact that more energy is not focused on reform discussions and is more focused on new issues. How do you expect to deliver new issues? how do you expect to deliver on new commitments when the checks and balances are not in place? Since 2020, if yeah, it's one of our favorite topics. Yes. The peace clause from 2013 was brought up. The reason that we want more is because the peace clause from 2013 covered only those specific staple foods. Staple foods and the definition of staple foods has shifted since 2013. Secondly, just to put on the record, roughly 800 million Indians, roughly, are dependent on public stockholders in India. So they're benefiting from welfare, which is based on public stockholding. So to say, and even despite 800 million Indians getting the benefits of this, it's only 0.5% of India's GDP. 0.5%. That's not a great number for a country my size. So let's put things in perspective when we're trying to, move the needle on certain things and push back on certain things. We have to have perspective on which are the countries we're dealing with. There was discussion of poverty earlier in an earlier session. Again, to put things in perspective, we were at 16.2% extreme poverty in 2011. We're at 2.3% as of 22-23. And a lot of this movement away from extreme poverty has been possible because of our welfare schemes. And a lot of this has been possible in spite of discussions at the WTO, not because of them. So let's have that perspective and clarity in place. Coming to the FTAs, because I don't know if it's already been brought up, but it is a specific issue. So I'm going to bring it up because it then leads to the e-commerce discussion as well. India has approached the new FTAs from two specific directions. One is from the consumer market perspective, and one is from the export and import of intermediate goods perspective. We've discussed for a while that India is trying to move up the value chain and industrialize and go into new sectors. So a certain set of FTAs that are being signed are very much about getting access to technology, getting access to investment, as was said. For example, the EFTA agreement that was referred to comes with a $100 billion FDI requirement over 15 years. Over the next 15 years, they're expected to invest $100 billion in the Indian economy. So there is a strategic interest in signing these FTAs, and that is the route through which we want investment coming into the country. The reason that we don't necessarily want a multilateral agreement on this, the discussion is still open in the country. The reason we're not having open discussions as of now is because we have complicated investment rules related to our neighborhood. And that's all I'm going to say on that. I'm sure it's very clear to everybody what I mean by the neighborhood. Coming to e-commerce, therefore. When we talk about e-commerce, India has often been the lab rat for e-commerce companies. We have a booming e-commerce market, but also we have generated the most data for all of these companies. From security architectures to how to safely deliver products, end-to-end servicing, the gig economy, jugaad culture, everything is coming out of the Indian market and the ASEAN market. So the e-commerce sector as a whole, being outside the purview of the state's ability to tariff it or tax it, is something that the Indian government has the right to study at least. And it's something that every state should have a right to study if they're from emerging economies and markets. Because the truth of the matter is that most e-commerce companies are registered in the West or run by the West. So it benefits companies in the West. We discussed tariffs from the US, we discussed the trade deficit. Let me give you a supply chain example on trade and services. I'm sitting on a Mac. I wrote my notes on a Microsoft Word document. I shifted it to an Adobe PDF to make other notes. These are all, MNCs. We pay for their subscriptions, right? That is investment royalties that are going to companies back in America. They're not going back into the pockets of Indians. So to say then that the trade deficit on goods is something that should be given so much.
Hang on a second. I want to push you on that point a little bit. As I mentioned earlier, as I said, anybody who's been to Bangalore, and knows the digital economy that is thriving there. I mean, I've landed there. You feel like you're in Silicon Valley when you get off the plane. And, India also has a thriving entertainment industry. I mean, Bollywood is streamed everywhere in the world. I believe the last I had heard, virtually all of the animation consumed in the United States is actually produced in India. So India has a thriving digital services economy, even if some of those companies are MNCs. Isn't that something that it would be concerning to India if other countries were to then place some type of duty on that content that India is such a powerhouse in the global economy on?
You're absolutely right. I'm not disagreeing with that. What I'm saying is we have a right to consider what is the tariff loss? What is the revenue loss to the Indian government? Because we have the largest entertainment industry. What is the tariff loss to the Indian government as we reduce tariffs on other sectors of traditional interest? It's as simple as that. So actually, that also brings me to the end of my notes. So back to you, really.
Okay. Well, thank you for that, and thank you for kind of giving that perspective on some of the things of how India is looking at some of these issues. In fact, there was a question from the audience on the plurilaterals, and that we are potentially oversimplifying India's position on the plurilaterals, and is this part of what India is doing bilaterally? Is that something that it potentially has more control over than these plurilaterals that are attempted to be negotiated at the WTO? I do want to get to the some of these FTAs that have been recently negotiated, and
Could I add something on that question, because I saw that question as well? Sorry, I didn't.
Please go ahead, Maria.
Because I do not think that we're oversimplifying. And of course everybody can have a different opinion, but I do not think that if you're looking at the issue from the WTO perspective, we're not really oversimplifying the fact that India just has taken a very strong position against plurilaterals writ large at the WTO. When you look at the Investment Facilitation for Development Agreement, widely 128 members. I think most of those members are actually developing countries. Again, India, often says they're leaders of the developing world. I leave that to the developing world to decide whether that's true or not. I know that from the person who sat next to me in the General Counsel room, which was from a so-called developing country, they disputed that was true. But anyway, I leave that to others. But they have refused. They're the only member that is refusing to allow that agreement to go forward. There are ways that there can be guardrails, absolutely. And I think I've even written about this. There are ways to make this happen. It is not rocket science. And I have commentated on it, and others have. And so you do have to wonder, this was not just an MC14 issue. This issue came up at MC13, and it came up before MC13. So again, I just have to point out, I mean, it has been a very strong position. Now, Ignacio makes a point that maybe they're shifting their position a little bit on IFDA, again, maybe because of the overwhelming support that agreement has, from developing countries. So we'll see what happens. Again, there are very easy solutions to this so-called problem. And I do want to, just push back a little bit on the comments about the JSIs not having a mandate. This is the problem, is that if you wait for consensus at the WTO on a mandate, then you don't have plurilaterals because, it's a chicken and egg problem, right? So you never get to it. So the JSIs arose precisely because you couldn't get a multilateral mandate to do those things. And again, my point that I hope everybody reflects on as we're all, I'm spending a lot of time thinking about, how do we fix the WTO? We're all saying it needs to be fixed. Well, how do you fix it? Sometimes you need, if you want to call it a club, but you need members who have a joint goal and a joint purpose to get together to start moving things forward. And then it is true, then it's up to those members to try to convince a broader set of members, whether that's something that needs to be further pursued. So again, to me, there's this a tension between saying you're for the multilateral trading system, but it's a multilateral trading system that is somewhat just completely static. And I just don't think that that's healthy for anybody, developed or particularly developing countries that have a lot of challenges still to deal with. I yield the floor.
No, thank you, Marina. That's helpful. And Ignacio, I turn it over to you. And if your comments are still on WTO, that's fine. But I want you to transition then into the EU-India FTA. Just for a little bit.
Okay, Don. I will transition absolutely, but I would just like to say one or two more words on the issue of plurilaterals. Because in my view, India is making a very legitimate point when it is arguing that it is important to develop legal guardrails when it comes to the integration of plurilaterals into the WTO. But at the same time, what is politically impossible to understand is that on an agreement like the IFD, we have 129 members, which is going to be implemented on an MFN basis, which has very deep special and differential treatment provisions. And which, of course, the moment it's integrated into the WTO, it becomes subject to the WTO dispute settlement procedure. What is the possible objection that India can make to the integration of that agreement in the WTO? For me, the logical thing for India to do would be to say, we're fine for the integration of IFD, but before we proceed to the integration of other plurilaterals into the WTO, we need to give priority to work on legal guidelines. I think that, in my view, would be the position that India could take, and I think it's something that India is ready to take that step. In my view, that would be a very big contribution towards seeing how to move forward the WTO agenda. But now I will transition to the very exciting moment on the bilateral relationship between India and the European Union, with the conclusion in January of this year of the free trade agreement. Let me say that this is not something that has been rapidly negotiated because there was a particular geopolitical context. It has really been a long time that India and the European Union have identified that they have a strategic interest in developing a free trade negotiation. I mean, I used to be responsible for the first phase in the negotiation of the free trade agreement with India when this was attempted in 2007. We came to the conclusion by 2014 that it was not going to work for a number of reasons. I would not want to look back into it. But then there was a very conscious political decision coming from the very top, both in the European Union and in India in 2021. There was a strong case for having geopolitically closer relations between the India and the European Union, but this would have no credibility unless both sides were able to deliver on an ambitious free trade agreement. And that was the reason why in 2021, it was basically decided to resume and to give a new impulse to the FTA negotiations. Now, these have now been concluded at the political level. What this basically means is that I understand that this very week, there's a team of European officials in Delhi working on the legal scrubbing of the text. So I think there's going to be an effort to try to get the FTA signed before the end of the year so they can actually enter into force after it has been ratified by the European Parliament early in 2027. Now, the text of the FTA is already public. The market access concessions are not yet public, but my sense is that this is an agreement which, first, from the India point of view, it is certainly by far the most ambitious market access agreement that India has concluded so far. It implies duty elimination on more than 90% of its trade with the European Union. It implies, of course, also ambitious commitments on the European Union side. It's also quite ambitious on services. And if you actually look into the rules, This is very much a comprehensive free trade agreement. It has 20 chapters of rules. It has, by the way, a chapter on good regulatory practices, which is part of the FTA. At the same time, in my view, it has been a signal that both sides are ready to be pragmatic in order to conclude the negotiations. For me, this is very much illustrated on the approach that has been taken to the issue of sustainable development, which is the way that we call the labor and environment provisions of the FTA. I remember that when I was in charge of the negotiation with India, it was a political no-go. There was no way that India and the European Union were going to agree on a sustainable development chapter. If you look at what is now included in the FTA, you will see that on substance, everything is quite ambitious. At the same time, it's pragmatic because it has been agreed that it would not work with India if it was going to be subject to a traditional arbitration type of dispute settlement procedure. So that's why you have instead a consultation mechanism that can go up to the political level if there is a disagreement about the implementation of the chapter. I think has also been pragmatic on looking into some of the issues that were difficult in the relationship, like CBAM. I mean, there has been a lot of discussion between India and the EU on CBAM. And if you actually look into the text of the FTA, you will see there's a specific annex about CBAM in which both parties have agreed to work to try to find solutions to some of the concerns relating to the implementation of CBAM. And hopefully it would also open a more pragmatic discussion between both sides about how to try to tackle those issues. Now, this being said, it is not a perfect free trade agreement. And from my point of view, there are at least 3 areas in which there are important gaps in the trade agreement. One has to do with the famous quality control orders, which, of course, I'm sure there's going to be a lot of discussions about them in this program. India is going through a process of reform of its quality control orders, and I think there have been a significant simplification in recent years, but it was not possible to agree on a legally binding commitment on that issue. So the FTA has basically a working group which is going to try to look into how to find solutions on issues relating to conformity assessment. It was not possible either to reach an agreement on public procurement. I think, as I understand it, from the European Union point of view, an agreement that was deeply asymmetrical would not be acceptable, and that's the reason why it was preferred not to have any section on public procurement at this point in time. But for me, quite frankly, the issue which I feel is a little bit more of a missed opportunity is investment. And I say that because, in my view, the most significant economic value of this FTA if it actually creates conditions to bring much more European Union investment into India. I mean, that's what could be really transformative in terms of generating much more perspective for growth and trade between both sides. And paradoxically, this agreement is very, very weak on investment. It has no commitments on investment market access in the manufacturing sector. There are separate discussions on investment protection, which I hear are not really making a lot of progress. I mean, as I said before, it's a different context, but the signals that India is giving on investment in the WTO are not very constructive. So in my view, one issue that both sides would really need to try to build upon is this whole investment dimension to see what one can do to go beyond what has been done on the FTA on investment. And I think that from that point of view, there's going to be a need to have creativity from both sides in terms of trying to see how to bring this investment dimension forward into the relationship. But all things being considered, I think this is a very important agreement, not only economically, of course, also geopolitically, strategically. And I think it's important to bear in mind that the European Union has now concluded ambitious free trade agreements with 4 major BRICS G20 countries. South Africa, we have one for quite some time, India, Indonesia, and Brazil.
Ignacio, thank you for that. And it was a great deep dive into the agreement and the importance of it. We are at time, but I do want to just, John B, in like 30 seconds, could you just articulate how this agreement and I guess generally the new FTAs are being received in India?
In one word, well. Okay. India signs FTAs with countries where there is an industry demand for FTAs. So the countries we signed FTAs with, there's an interest from our companies to partner with these companies and these countries. So that is the short of it. The long of it is that besides traditional strengths like pharmaceuticals and ready-made garments, we're also going into new sectors like machinery and machine parts. So if we look at the top 10 export and import markets, export and import goods for each of these FTAs, a very interesting picture emerges of what we want in and out of these FTAs.
Great. No, thank you very much for that. And thank you to the panelists. I think we had a really good discussion on both multilateral and on the bilateral. And I want to highlight, Maria had a great point at the beginning talking about India being an expert, I think, at the art of being indispensable. And we have certainly seen that. India is a force to be reckoned with in the multilateral as well as in the bilateral negotiations. I want to remain hopeful and optimistic, like Ignacio, that maybe this is a second opening of India's economy that we're seeing. And John B. kind of just backed that up with India's move into higher tech sectors in its FTAs that it is looking to expand into, including in machinery and manufacturing. And, one thing I took away from this discussion is, and having worked with India both multilaterally and bilaterally, it is always so helpful to really understand as a negotiator what is driving some of India's positions in its negotiations from the domestic landscape. And I think, John B., your comments today kind of articulating that were very helpful. And I think for the negotiators in Geneva and in other countries, kind of understanding that domestic perspective is always extremely helpful. We may not always agree with it, as you have seen as part of this discussion. But it is helpful and then allows more of those discussions to take place. And one of the things I'm interested in seeing in the final outcomes of the EU agreement or possibly in the US agreement is, will any of these major economies address WTO issues in these bilateral agreements that might help move towards more plurilaterals at the WTO or resolve the e-commerce issue between countries in India for the long haul going forward. Something for those negotiators to consider as they're putting a bow on things and dotting the I's and the final crossing the T's. And with that, Diego, I will turn it back over to you. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Dawn, and thank you for your help in helping us organize today's session. I think we definitely could have extended it another 40 minutes and had a more fruitful conversation, but really appreciate Ignacio having your perspectives from Europe, John V, you in India, and Maria and Dawn here in the US. Thank you for today's session. Thank you for all of you today joining us online, wherever you are in the world. If you missed any of the presentations, we will be sending out links for the videos later today, and you'll have a personalized login where you can access the videos for the next 30 days. And then for tomorrow, we will start at the same time, 9 a.m. US Eastern, 6:30 p.m. India Standard Time. And then we will be jumping into some of these sectoral issues. We'll be talking about India's competitiveness strategy, also looking at digital trade. And then on day 3, we will look at healthcare, pharmaceuticals, critical minerals, and emerging tech. So definitely we'll be continuing the conversations that were started today and look forward to having you all join us. Thank you again to this panel and see you all tomorrow.